Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Strauss Center's latest event. Welcome, Scott Anderson, to the Strauss Center's latest event. I'm Bobby Chesney. I'm the director of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law here at the University of Texas at Austin. The Strauss Center, as many of you already know, is a university-wide enterprise that explores a wide array of international relations and national security topics, uh, very often ones relating to law, though not exclusively that. We touch on just about everything. Today's program, though, is very much from our core national security law focus. And we're really lucky to be joined by my pal, Scott Anderson, who I'm going to give the standard introduction to here in a moment. Scott, let me just say that it's always been a pleasure to work with you over the years at Lawfare and in other settings. And I don't think we've had the pleasure of pulling you into the world of UT Austin before. I could be mistaken about that. You may have come here once or twice. No? You're on
First
mute.
timer.
First timer. Well, we're not doing it right since we're obviously not giving you any breakfast tacos or barbecue. So we owe you one officially. We owe you multiple. Let me give the full official bio. Scott is a senior fellow with the National Security Law Program, as well as a fellow at Columbia, and also is a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. And he's senior editor and counsel for Lawfare, which it kind of makes me chuckle to describe it this way. It's an online publication committed to the analysis of hard national security choices. It's also a blog that Ben Wittes and Jack Goldsmith and I started, oh, so many years ago, having no idea it would ever actually employ people, let alone be read by anyone who's not actually related to us. So I love it that we have that connection as well, Scott. Scott's a former U.S. diplomat and experienced international lawyer. He previously served as an attorney advisor for the State Department and as the legal advisor for the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq. In these capacities, he advised policymakers on domestic and international legal issues relating to U.S. foreign and national security policy, particularly as they relate to the Middle East and North Africa. Among other issues, his portfolio included bilateral relations with Iraq, counter-Islamic State efforts in Iraq and Syria, select Israeli-Palestinian issues, terrorism-related civil litigation, U.S. and international economic sanctions, and the Yemen conflict, just to throw that in. He also helped to represent the department in a number of litigation and international arbitration matters, including Zivotofsky v. Kerry, which is a huge Supreme Court case many of you will know, and other matters before the Supreme Court. Scott previously served as an international affairs fellow through the Council on Foreign Relations, and during which time he was affiliated with Harvard Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School. He's clerk for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. He's a graduate of UVA and Yale Law, and he and his wife Elizabeth live in Washington, but he's with us here today. Scott, really happy to have you on board. And just looking over the participant list, I see both a lot of our current students who are really interested in the career pathway you've charted for yourself, and some of our former students, which it's really nice to see some of y'all there as well. So Scott, how about this? How about I turn it over to you and you tell us your story. How did you chart a pathway that came from law school to these remarkable sequence of things you've done, and then build in as much perspective as you can about national security legal careers more generally? Once we get to the end, I may have some moderated dialogue type questions for you, but also all of y'all who are watching this live, please start posting your questions to the chat, or even better, save your question, raise your hand, and we'll open it up. It's a pretty manageable classroom sized enterprise here. So if you're willing, when we get to the open Q&A, you can just put your hand up. I'll call on you and you can unmute. You can even come off video if you care to, and we can have more of a direct, casual dialogue. I hope that sounds good to everybody. Scott, it's all yours.
Hey, thank you so much, Bobby. And I'm really excited to be with you all. I am, well, this is my first time, I guess, with the Strauss Center or UT. Austin is one of my absolute favorite cities in the world. I'm very jealous you're there in person, and hopefully get a chance to come out and visit you all in person at some point in the future once all this is behind us. Until then, I'm really excited to talk to you guys about national security law careers. Bobby and the rest of the folks at the Strauss Center run an amazing program. They're amazing folks who come out of UT every year, coming into the field of national security law, national security policy. And it's a great opportunity for me to get to meet you all before you head out to DC or head out into the other places where those careers tend to be pursued, and hopefully give you some advice along the way to something that can be useful. Bobby gave kind of a good overview of my career. I think it's kind of three big chunks. Essentially, I came out of law school, spent 5 years at the State Department, where a lot of my most significant government experience came into play. I was an attorney advisor working on a whole array of Middle East issues during a pretty tumultuous time in U.S. policy towards the Middle East and the Middle East in general. A year and a half of that time was spent as the legal advisor for the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. It's a little bit of a made-up title because most embassies do not have legal advisors, but the embassy in Baghdad did have one, and I was the one there, actually the last one, before we ended up shutting that office down. And so that gave me informed a lot of my career choices from then onward, both in terms of a focus on the Middle East, which I'd always had an interest in, but also getting a lot of kind of hands-on experience engaging in direct diplomacy, actually engaging with foreign officials in a variety of contexts that, frankly, a lot of government lawyers don't have the opportunity to do. And it's an incredible opportunity, although obviously it had some stressful moments and there were some trade-offs there as well. I should note before the State Department, I spent some time at the National Security Division at DOJ as a student, also at the White House Counsel's Office, and have worked in DOJ and the State Department in kind of other capacities before going to law school. So I can talk a little bit about them. My experience, though, is really informed primarily by the State Department and the other offices I work with really closely in my time at the State Department, such as the Defense Department, and subsequent to that. Since leaving government in 2015, I spent a year as a law clerk, as Bobby noted, kind of something that I wasn't sure I wanted to do right after law school and decided to go ahead and do before, the opportunity kind of slipped away and I felt like I was too old to do it. Although no one should ever feel like they're too old to do that if you're so inclined. And then I ended up in think tank world through a kind of weird confluence of events. I was engaged to my now wife, who was finishing law school herself up in Boston. I wanted to find something to do for a year that would allow us to stop doing long distance and before I intended to go back into government, honestly, having resigned to take my clerkship for a year to avoid any conflict of interest issues, things like that. I ended up getting really lucky with the Council on Foreign Relations with a wonderful program called the International Affairs Fellowship, which I can't recommend highly enough. That let me do a really fascinating research project based in Boston, so I could co-locate with my fiance. But that was the year of the election. And so by the time that wrapped up, there was a hiring freeze at the State Department. It was headed in a very different direction than it happened when I left. I also became involved with some organizing around the travel ban and other issues that affected people I used to work with and issues I care about deeply at a personal level. And so I elected not to go back into government, which had always been my plan. I was left kind of in this position of saying, well, what do I do now, having spent my legal career in a very specialized area of national security and international law? And I explored opportunities in private sector, which is a tricky but still an option, and got really lucky to get some offers from really wonderful law firms there, but ended up instead choosing to go to the Brookings Institution, where I spent for 2 years as a David Rubenstein Fellow working with Lawfare, and Ben Mittis, who's Bobby's co-founder of Lawfare, who's kind of resident there. And then for the last 2 years, I've been really lucky to get to split my time between Lawfare and Brookings with the National Security Law program at Columbia, where I co-teach a class every once a year, every fall semester with Matt Waxman on constitutional war powers, meet with students, work with students, do an array of projects, both with that program and with Bobby and the Strauss Center as well a bit. And so it's been a wonderful ride, not at all the career I expected, which I think is a theme you'll hear from a lot of people who end up working in national security and foreign affairs related jobs, but a really rewarding one. I think it's worth thinking about jobs. I have kind of like a canned advice, if you will, when I talk about job stuff, which I'll put out there just to kind of preempt questions and we can dig a little deeper on what's useful for you guys. But I think it's useful to really think about national security type jobs, starting with the executive branch, because the United States and for US lawyers, so much of it centers on the executive branch. And they're really, most of the jobs there tend to center around 4 Ds. 3 of the Ds will be familiar to anyone who works in foreign affairs or foreign relations. Those are the 3 Ds often associated with that area. It's defense, development, and diplomacy. To that, I would add a fourth, which is really domestic, for lack of a better, I couldn't come up with a better D word, honestly, but domestic seems to work, which I think covers the national security issues that fit within the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, where even though there's often a very international nexus, international consideration, they often center on domestic legal issues, whereas defense issues and defense development and diplomacy, while there's certainly a strong domestic legal component, there's also a very strong international law component as well. The fifth big actor in the executive branch in that sort of career universe is the intelligence community, which is worth talking about. They kind of span a couple of these groups. I also couldn't come up with a good D for that one. And the truth is, like, depending on what your portfolio is or what you're working on, your work will look a lot like the domestic sphere or potentially the diplomacy or defense sphere. We can dig in a little bit more on that based on, again, my secondhand experience with folks who work in the IC. A lot of legal jobs in government and in national security lean very heavily towards the domestic, which makes sense because that's where U.S. law plays the most central role. So Justice Department, obviously, most of the people there are lawyers. Department of Homeland Security, fair contingent of lawyers there as well. Development, diplomacy, defense, those areas do have core lawyers who work on them. And really, those are the three areas, particularly diplomacy and defense, where I've spent most of my career. But it is a little bit of a narrower role for lawyers traditionally, or not narrow, maybe just fewer lawyers there, much more policy driven. But there's often a little bit of trade-off and exchange between policy and rules as well. So you really, when you're thinking about national security jobs, it's worth thinking about which of those areas you are most interested in, which one covers the issues you're passionate about, that you care about, because that shapes a little bit the directions you're going to move in. It's as I'll get to in a little bit. It's not worth not being too picky. There's enough overlap. There's enough relationships between those different offices that getting experience in one can help you get jobs in the others. But it's at least as a first order, start thinking about, okay, which of these really fits with me? Because national security itself can mean so many different things to so many different people. It's worth noting other institutions outside of the executive branch that work in national security and can be a great place to find jobs in this field. Often a little bit map on to that kind of division because so much of them are oriented towards the executive branch. Capitol Hill very much does. Of course, there's different committees of jurisdiction, so staffers will tend to be an expert on, national security issues as before the Judiciary Committee, or they'll work for the Foreign Affairs Committee on very diplomacy related issues. That again, there's transference to people who kind of straddle those, but they do kind of fall into those tranches fairly often. Think tanks and advocacy groups do as well. Lawfare is kind of an exception because we branch overall so many, but most think tank tend to have projects that are a little more narrowly focused, or at least that's where they hire for. And so they'll probably fit in one of these. And honestly, there aren't a ton of think tanks that spend much time thinking about legal authorities and legal issues. Brookings is pretty exceptional for that, with Lawfare being kind of the leading edge on that. There are a couple other groups that have lawyers among their ranks who are working on legal issues, but it's relatively rare. Most people work primarily on policy facing issues at think tanks. Advocacy groups really similarly because they tend to be issue based, tend to fit in kind of one of these buckets and engage primarily with agencies from one of these buckets. IOs, international organizations, multilateral groups are another interesting place to work. They tend to, for obvious reasons, fit most squarely in diplomacy and development sort of spheres and interact with those agencies, deal with those issues. Some deal with defense issues as well. You think of NATO, things like that. Less on the domestic front, obviously, because they tend to be more externally facing. And then you also have another area that's worth thinking about that overlaps a lot with this conversation about national security and foreign relations careers is human rights groups and human rights advocacy and related sorts of groups. I'm not going to spend as much time on that because I know most law schools, and I'm sure UT does, really have centers that do amazing human rights work and give really good advice about how to do that, and frankly are better situated to do that than I will. But I think it's worth flagging because it is another area where people can work in international affairs. And so when you're weighing both the kind of, that's kind of the substantive side, here's the different areas where these jobs tend to fall. It's also worth thinking about big questions about the type of role you want to fill, because that will guide a little bit where you look for jobs among these different areas. There's kind of four big questions that I've asked myself over the course of my career, and I think they're good ones to start with, although they're not exhaustive. The first one is, do you want to be domestic or do you want to be overseas? They're not mutually exclusive. Most of my career has been US based, but I have spent substantial time overseas and may have opportunities to do so again. They tend to be very different. There aren't that many opportunities for lawyers to go overseas in the executive branch or really many other places because we're trained in US law. Maybe hopefully we get some training in international law as well. That can be useful. But the core market for our skills tends to be US facing. And so they tend to be pretty domestically based. There are places that do send lawyers overseas. State Department sends a few lawyers to different places overseas for rotations, but it tends to be most lawyers at the State Department will spend the vast majority of their careers at home in the United States. the USAID is kind of an exception to this. They have many lawyer positions overseas. I think they're really interesting legal work and often kind of overlooked and not fully appreciated for what fascinating and wonderful careers they have there. And I'm not just saying that because their general counsel is my former colleague Margaret Taylor, who would be also be a wonderful boss to work for. But I know lots of people who have had wonderful careers at the USAID on the legal side. That often it's not a place where people look who are interested in these sets of issues, which I think is a mistake. If you're interested in being domestic, you have a lot more options open to you because you have lots of these different jobs. You're not trying to angle for the ones that might give you a chance to go overseas. If you do want to go overseas, defense, diplomacy, development, obviously they give you much more angles on those sorts of items. The military is an option in terms of having some overseas experience, but ultimately in kind of different specific sorts of roles. And then of course you have IOs and other groups that can send lawyers overseas, but are also tricky. We can dig into that a little bit if you guys are interested in that. Often in kind of very limited, more specific mission sets, but not always. Another major question that often interfaces with the domestic overseas one is whether you want to have a legal or a policy role. A legal role, you are really using your legal education. You're doing legal training, and there are certain advantages for that. You often come in at a little bit of a higher level. That matters both in terms of kind of seniority for bidding on other positions in government, at least, or trying to get hired for other positions outside of government. It also often means a little higher pay, which is nice. You're still a public servant in vast majority of these positions, so you're not making private sector money, but you have a little bit better quality of life and can pay off your loans, which was a big consideration for me, and I'm sure is for many of you as well, coming out of law school. Policy rules are a little less predictable. People find them really appealing because you really get to focus on a particular issue set. You often get to feel a little bit more like you're the decider, whereas when you're the legal role, you're often advising the policymakers that ultimately are the decision makers. Although often, the decisions are actually made at a much higher level than even the policymakers that are kind of more entry level or mid level. We have to think about what sort of issues you want. Do you like the technical side of working through legal issues and engaging in legal reasoning and like the role of a lawyer giving legal advice? If so, then the legal roles are worth pursuing. They're a little more narrow. There are fewer of them. But as a lawyer, you have a lot of other people's a little smaller market. Policy roles could be a wide variety. It depends on the types of issue you're working at. A legal education is often very valuable for policy roles. There are a lot of ex-lawyers or people with legal backgrounds who take on policy roles in national security. But you are a little bit maybe more the decision maker, more the conventional decision making stream. But you are often narrowly focused, a little more narrowly specialized, and your legal skills, you're not using them, and that can be a problem over the course of career, particularly early in your career. It's a lot easier to go from start as a legal position and then move towards a policy position, and then if you want, come back, because you're often seen as having that kind of foundational experience as an attorney. If you go particularly early in your career towards a straight policy position, sometimes it's hard to step back and move into a more formal legal role, simply because people say, well, really, you learn the most about being a lawyer in your first 2 to 4 years out of law school. I think that's true, honestly, in most cases. And so when you skip that to do something that's not legally oriented, it's hard to come back and make up for that. Sometimes you can come back if you're willing to drop some levels in seniority, things like that, but that poses its own personal challenges. A third question to really ask yourself about the types of position is whether it's government or not for you. There's a lot of trade-offs. The government's a great place to work. I think there's a lot to be said for it. Public service, I think, is valuable, although public service covers both government and lots of non-government work totally validly. But there are frustrations. You are part of a bureaucracy. You are part of an institution that you may not agree with everything it does all the time. And so that can be a tricky trade-off to say, well, how much am I willing to compromise to contribute toward an organization that might do things I don't like in some areas, to have the input that I do have in this one area I care about, or to get other experiences and knowledge in a particular area that I want to work in. So it's a personal call, and you have to think about that. But there are different types of roles outside of government. You have much more freedom to comment. You have much more freedom to develop ideas and advocate for ideas and speak for yourself as an individual, and that can be really refreshing and rewarding. I will admit, but when I was in government for most of my career. I wasn't able to really speak out or write op-eds and things like that. And I admit, I found it actually really refreshing and personally rewarding to do that the last few years. It doesn't mean I wouldn't consider going back into government again. I very well might. But it is something that I will miss if I go back into government, because there is a freedom there that I don't think I appreciated. I was missing when I was in government for several years early on in my career. The fourth point, and this is kind of a subcategory within government, but I'll break out fourth, is whether you are willing to be a career or a political. I don't think this is a binary. I don't think it's worth shoving yourself into one or the other too clearly, but they each do pose a little bit of different questions about both the type of roles and then the type of positions you should be looking for or thinking about. A career position can be great because A, you have job stability, B, you have a chance to develop sometimes really deep expertise over the course of your career in a particular area. You often become an indispensable part of the government apparatus in a particular policy area that gives you a little bit of kind of outsized sway on that particular issue set, or at least an important component of any sort of policy conversation. And there's a lot to be said for that. But again, you are still part of this bureaucracy that can be a little frustrating. And then the reason I contrast it with the political is that even in government, if you're willing to make a compromise for one political administration, maybe you have really strong feelings that you may not be confident that you're willing to do that for another administration. And this is just a real concern we have to be honest about. Like, you have to ask yourself, how willing am I to make this a career? Because if you're a career attorney, should be oriented towards being a career, meeting for a decade or two, if that's really how you envision your career going. And that means weathering through inevitably presidential administrations whose views are different from yours. And so you have to think to yourself, okay, well, maybe I can shift to a position where their views aren't as different from mine. It depends from one or the other. And it can be hard to know 100% in advance. But it's something worth asking yourself. If you really are committed to political, you like politics, you like doing the political side of policy and where they intersect, and that does happen in the national security space. Then you want to think about a little about different positions. Maybe a career position makes sense for a period, but it may make more sense to go to the Hill or another place where those issues are inevitably more interwoven. If you're a career position, inevitably you have to be more bipartisan, particularly if you are in a enhanced Hatch Act type position where your political activities are legitimately limited by law. In those cases, you can't be the political actor you may want to be, but to the full extent. You still have a good bundle of political rights, but not in the same ways you can be if you're not in one of those positions. And so if you are really care about politics and care about national security policy as a part of a bigger political set of preferences, then you might be leaned to a little bit more towards political types jobs. Um, this is all kind of leads me to kind of five big pieces of advice. Those are kind of the questions to think about and how to structure your thinking about government jobs. But my big piece of advice that I've kind of tried to follow through my career, that I'll leave you with or not leave you with, we'll go to Q&A afterwards. But that I give to everyone who's kind of looking in this career. The first thing is you really have to chase opportunities as they come. National security careers are very eclectic. They're very diverse. You don't know what opportunities are going to be available to you until you're there, and you have to kind of just take them. It may not be the perfect position for you, but if you are in an area that is, two steps closer to what you think you really want to do, that's a great opportunity, because it's hard to get those opportunities to take those steps closer. There aren't a whole lot of natural, linear progression career paths in national security. And so you do have to kind of tack back and forth and say, all right, I'm going to take this job. It's not quite what I want, but it gives me this skill set or this experience or this exposure, and I'm going to move over to something else later. So don't hesitate to do that. I think it's just part of the nature in this sort of a career field. The second thing I would say is get your hands dirty early and often. This is something I've really benefited from, going to get field experience in whatever field experience means to you, whether it's a career prosecutor, whether it is a diplomat, whether it is somebody in the military, whether a law enforcement officer, really, really is valuable. It gives you a lot of credibility to speak on things. It gives you an incredible amount of perspective. I think about things really fundamentally differently, I think, than frankly a lot of people who kind of work in my field but have always been more in the bureaucratic side of things, because I've gone out and done engagements with foreign government officials, and I've done the diplomacy side of things in a limited capacity, but still a not insubstantial capacity. And that really has influenced my career in all sorts of wonderful ways and significant ways. And I really think those sorts of firsthand experiences are really valuable, particularly early on. If you're talking about foreign affairs, national security, there can be real compromises of that. Often involves going overseas or doing things that might be even a little dangerous or a little bit off the beaten path. And that can be hard to do later in your life too. And now I have a wife and I have a son, and it'd be very hard for me to get up and go to Baghdad for a year and a half. People do it, but it'd be hard for me to do it. I know my wife has told me as much, that I'm not doing that again anytime soon, even though I actually met her in Baghdad. But for that reason, I think it's something worth thinking about, particularly in your early stages of your career. The third thing I'd say is first person relationships really matter. All these jobs, because they are very selective, and because there are a lot of people interested in them, relationships really matter a lot. And the best thing you can do is, particularly if you're interested in government jobs, is get on the ground in DC. That means, internships, summer internships, externships, opportunities to meet people, whether it's in government or outside of government in DC, and start networking. That sounds obnoxious. Networking is a terrible term. I hate networking. I'm a very awkward person. I don't enjoy it. But it is really necessary. And when you are working with people, those relationships you build in engaging in that work relationship are integral to getting your next job. Even if it's not where you want to work, those are the people who have the credibility to say this person is effective at their job. And that's what most people are looking for. And that will make more difference than just about anything else. So getting on the ground where you want to be working or adjacent to where you want to be working really matters a whole lot. And so really worth thinking about in terms of, again, summer externships, or even if you guys have a DC semester program, highly recommend those. A lot of people discount those more than they should. The fourth thing I'll say, and this puts me a little bit out of whack with a lot of public interest career speakers, but I will say it, is don't underestimate the value of a safety net. This is actually advice that John Bellinger, former legal advisor for the State Department, given me, I think, like 3 or 4 times now, and I've declined to follow it every time, perhaps to my detriment. But he's always said, you get a lot out of when you're in a national security career, where inevitably you are having to move around different places, unless you're a career person who's just in an agency for the entirety of your career, which there are people who do that and or have great careers, but a lot of people end up moving around a fair amount. And when you're moving around like that, it's nice to have a kind of safety net option, be it a bucket of skills that are just marketable, or a relationship with an institution like a law firm that you have people there who will help facilitate you coming back if you find yourself having a year or two where you don't know what your next step is. And law firms are willing to do that. Not all of them, but some of them are. And I don't think a law firm's a bad place to start a national security law career at all. Something worth really seriously considering, especially because there are lots of legal practices that are really touching on national security and foreign relations related issues, whether it's CFIUS, sanctions, FCPA investigations, international investment arbitration, commercial arbitration, cyber issues, these emergency response teams that are increasingly common in law firms these days. Really interesting work that can get you real experience. And lots of agencies and outside international organizations, other groups, they often hire people from law firms that have these sorts of skill sets, because they really do see law firms as a place to get good training. So I don't think it's a bad option if you are interested in a national security career to start out right out of law school at a law firm, or a clerkship and then spend time at a law firm, or vice versa. I never did that. I summered at a law firm and that was about it. I've thought about and almost gone into law firms multiple times and haven't. And I've at various times kind of regretted it, although I've really enjoyed my career. So it's hard for me to say I would have done anything differently. But I definitely sometimes feel that lack of a safety net when I'm hitting transition moments and I'm not sure what my next gig will be or what my next position might be. Then those are the moments where I'm like, man, well, I have a kid and a wife and a house and a mortgage. I gotta find something out there to figure out how to make this work. And it'd be nice to have those fallbacks that right now I don't, in part because I never took those opportunities. The fifth thing I'll say, and I think this is the most important, is no matter what you're doing, and especially if you do find yourself at a law firm or a place where its relevance to national security and foreign relations work isn't as centrally relevant, is that you always should try and stay part of a conversation around the issues that you're interested in and want to work in. That means that, if you're in private practice, take private practice assignments that touch on those to the extent you can, or find yourself into those practice areas. In your free time, try and write, posts for publications like Lawfare, or for, op-ed pages, or for other weblogs, or, comments and notes for student law reviews, or for the online components of student law reviews. Doing those sorts of things really makes you, shows your continued interest in these sorts of issues. It shows that you've developed some independent expertise. It helps you stand out against other candidates who might have similar qualifications. And those things really matter in the end, because ultimately you are building a case to somebody to hire you, not just based off your skill set, not just based off of your qualifications and how good grades you are and things like that, or you have and things like that, but also the fact that you are passionate and interested in a field that can be really demanding. And so that independent drive really can say a lot to people, not to mention the independent drive to then learn something enough to say something smart about it in the public, in a publication, makes a big difference. Another great area is professional groups, things like ASIL, American Society of International Law, or Washington Foreign Law Society. I think is here in DC. I don't think it has much presence outside of DC, but it's a really interesting group. These other groups give you a chance to kind of network and meet people and build those relationships that are important in terms of figuring out your next path, so that even if you're not working in one of these 4D areas now, it lets you meet people who are and can help guide you towards new opportunities as they become available to you. Um, that's kind of my spiel, my kind of generic government / national security and foreign relations law career advice. Bobby, I'll turn it back over to you to about any specific questions folks may have or anything like that, and I'm happy to dig deeper on any of this as it's useful.
Terrific, Scott. Thank you so much. You kind of make me want to wind back the clock and start over. Better decisions on my part.
That's how I feel every time I give a talk like this.
What actually really strikes me about this, I think back to the 1990s when I was in school, and first of all, there weren't events like this. There weren't organizations like this. There's nothing like Lawfare. There were there weren't as many national security institutions. And when I was in the mid 90s in school, trying to figure out how to chart a path that would be what I would now describe as national security law, I was really at my wit's end. It felt like you could maybe join the FBI. Although at the time in the 90s, when I went to an FBI recruitment and asked, well, would I be able to focus on terrorism related things? And they said, well, that's not exactly the day-to-day most common thing we deal with. You'll be doing a lot more bank robberies, et cetera. And you could maybe, you wouldn't even necessarily think that joining the military would lead you down a pathway other than classic operational law. The irregular conflicts were a little bit on the horizon. No cybersecurity, private practice, very limited overlap, really. I mean, people might refer to a national security practice, but very often they meant issues people had with clearances, perhaps, maybe issues coming out of classified defense industrial based contract disputes and IP disputes. Well, enough about that. Let's talk about the questions actually that are already starting to percolate from our awesome audience. I'm going to pitch one from my former student, Jonathan Slack. Jonathan, so glad that you were able to join us. And he's got a couple of good ones. I'll throw one out there now, and then we'll go next. Patrick, I'll come to you next. You've got a question in the queue. Let me know in the chat if I can just call on you and you can pitch that, or if you'd rather have me read it out. But anyways, here's Jonathan's first one. Regarding the point about cutting your teeth on legal work earlier in your career as opposed to specializing in a policy position, are there certain positions in particular executive departments or intelligence agencies that you'd be wary of taking as a young attorney? It's often difficult to determine from the paragraph-long job description exactly what kind of work you'd really be doing in those places. So what are the pitfalls to avoid, either organizationally or in general?
That's a really good question. I will be honest with you. I don't think there are many jobs that, as an entry level, I would consider not taking. I'll use the State Department as an example. I can think of a few other places where sometimes people talk badly about entry level jobs. So at the State Department, in the Office of Legal Advisor, where I started my career, you traditionally have to spend your first rotation, meaning traditionally 2 years. Sometimes it's a little shorter. Like I left after a year and a half because I volunteered to go to Baghdad. Some people stay a little bit longer. But usually you do your first rotation, what's called a functional office. So it's something like management affairs, employee issues, and employee sort of employment law, I guess is the name of the office. Buildings and acquisitions, which does kind of real estate issues. And a lot of people kind of look down at these issues. They say, well, I don't want to go to the State Department that's spent a year or 2 years dealing with real estate contracts or dealing with these kind of more mundanities, as a lot of people see them. I spent my first rotation doing claims and investment disputes, which was really interesting and like sometimes seen as a little more substantive, but ultimately was like dealing with a lot of administrative processes and pseudo litigation and arbitration issues that had a lot of exciting moments, but also had a lot of drudgery and frankly was a lot of work. And what I say is that it's actually really nice, particularly early in your career, to be in positions like that, where you get a lot of oversight and guidance from your supervisors and a lot of support from your institution, because they are kind of designed for entry-level attorneys to come in and get a chance to orient yourself both to the bureaucracy and the institution you're operating in, and to get your grounding as a real lawyer. Because law school does a lot of great things. It actually, one thing it's not always great about is actually like getting you ready to be a lawyer in the real world. You get that really from experience, because it's just hard to explain the sorts of decisions and reasoning that comes into play, and the compromise you have to be made engaging clients, things like that. And so, particularly if you're coming straight out of college, or maybe or probably straight out of law school, or straight out of a clerkship, where you just don't have prior experience, it's nice to have that sorts of support. Another similar thing is I've heard people say there are certain jobs in like the National Security Division at the Justice Department that relate to FISA court type stuff that people say, you don't want to take one of those jobs. Like they are, you're stuck doing like really narrow types of work. And what I say is, that can be really good, particularly in your career, or if you're trying to make a transition into that agency, because at least you're there, you're in the building, you're talking to people, you're meeting people, and you're getting experience that's going to let you go do something else down the road. You can't think of each job as being like, is this my dream job? You got to take the opportunities as they come to you. And so I would say, I don't think there's a lot you would avoid. The one thing that you have to ask yourself is if there's something really happening in an office that you just don't want to be involved in for personal ethical reasons. And this comes up for everybody. Some people just are very much like, I don't want to be involved in anything that kills people. And that's a totally legitimate choice. A lot of people would have a lot of trouble being involved with things regarding aspects of immigration policy, whether that last administration or this administration, depending on how you feel about it, right? I would have had a lot of trouble dealing in the prior administration on refugee issues because it's something I feel really strongly about and, had a personal vested interest in to some degree. And so, you have to make those choices, but that's so personal, individual. It's not something I can give advice to you about. That's really your call you have to make.
Awesome. Well, we've got a bunch of questions now starting to pile up, and I'm going to begin reading from a few. So an interesting question about the connection between these sorts of careers, both in policy and law, and getting involved in electoral politics. We've all seen there are any number of members of Congress who have backgrounds, both practicing backgrounds, legal backgrounds that relate to the IC or national security or the military. What are your observations on whether is this something that actually can be leveraged into a political career effectively, or is it just correlation but not causation when you see that sort of thing?
It's also a great question. We do have this kind of new generation of leadership, particularly in the House, that are former national security officials. So you think of like Andy Kim from New Jersey, Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan, who are just really wonderful legislators and public servants. I've known a number of these people and I've supported them in some of their campaigns and do like really, really interesting work in government and now have come and are channeling that into the House of Representatives. And I don't, maybe they'll stay there for the next 30 years, or maybe they're going to go on and do something else later in their careers. What I would say, though, is that I don't think that's a very natural progression. I think it's a really good one when it happens. Congress needs experts like that. And particularly it's really useful when actual legislators have real experience to bring to bear. And I think those legislators have been real leaders on issues that really matter for the last few years in the national security space. But and they can spin a little bit. You can say, oh, I have this added experience where I have, understand national security, I understand foreign affairs. Is that going to win you an election? I don't know. It probably matters on your district. I'd be pretty surprised most places as somebody who does political stuff periodically and have always watched politics, right? But I'm not an expert. Talk to a real expert. But I would be surprised. If you really want to do politics, go into politics. Go work for campaigns. Go to Capitol Hill, maybe where you can get some experience on the substance side, but also have that intersection with political work. I don't think going into national security positions is a natural path to electoral politics. Quite the opposite, honestly.
Well, here's a similar sort of career progressions type of question. A number of law students over time end up as AUSAs. They're your prosecuting cases, and that might be these days. It might well lead you to be involved in some cybersecurity related matters, so prosecuting Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and wire fraud things, so cybercrime. That particular dimension of federal prosecution work, or even just general federal prosecution work on the criminal side, do you view either of those as lending themselves naturally to doing that lateral movement within the national security career pathways? Or even with cyber, is that still a little bit too far afield? It's just a different government function than kind of the stuff that's more obviously close to the core of a national security career.
I think all of those are phenomenal experiences and very much lend themselves to the sorts of lateral moves I was talking about. A prosecutor, being an AUSA is like one of the coolest jobs you can have. It's super fun. I was a paralegal for AUSAs and SDNY before law school. And I got to be honest with you, like one of the jobs I wish I have had in my career, and maybe I still will one day, although I kind of doubt it at this stage, is to be an AUSA somewhere because it's just fascinating, interesting work and like getting to run your own cases. It's exciting. It's interesting doing investigations. It's phenomenal. So it's just intrinsically good, and it's a great skill set, and it gives you the credibility that comes with getting your hands dirty and actually being in the mix and being at the tip of the spear for, in that case, law enforcement operations, but a major policy initiative of the executive branch. You're the guy actually executing, and that really matters a lot. Whatever you're doing where it's in those areas, you can lateral that and build a case for yourself to find other opportunities. And DOJ has a huge national security presence. It's not just the national security division, although a lot of it's kind of centralized around there. Every USA office, as Bobby noted, or U.S. Attorney's Office, I should say, like has opportunities to do national security related cases. If it's not cyber stuff, you're going to deal with, IEPA violations potentially. EDNY does tons of IEPA violations that intersect with things around like, Hezbollah support and a variety of other sorts of programs that are happening or activities that are happening there. And other parts of the country have those sorts of specialties. It's worth looking at the dockets of like the AUSA's office or the U.S. Attorney's Office you're thinking about going to say how much of that work do they get. Some of them have like committed national security units, which are pretty amazing when you can get an opportunity to work with there. You'll probably have to go in entry level. You're not going to be able to steer yourself right there. And then when you get there, maybe think about what cases you want to go. Don't go do maybe securities prosecution if you really want to do this. Maybe go to violent crimes, or maybe go to again some whatever unit is doing sanctions type violations, because that gives you that sort of nexus. But it's a great skill set, great exposure, and even if only you do 20% of your time on those cases, that's 20% of your time more than a lot of other people, and so that gives you an edge, and it's worth pursuing.
It's great. What about folks who are in law school but are also doing regional or area studies, like Middle East studies? We have a lot of that at UT Austin because we have, it's just such a big, broad campus with so many strong units. So what's the best place to look to leverage that sort of combined expertise? Which types of positions or which organizations, and there's some more obvious than others perhaps, would you recommend for someone who's got that dual interest?
It's a great question, and it's a tricky one. I kind of come from this vein, probably not to the extent of many of your students, but I was always a Middle Eastern studies guy in college. Almost thought to do Middle Eastern studies. I once upon a time studied Arabic. Never really did very well with it, but tried and made a good faith effort. My French is slightly better, at least. I really love the Middle East region. I think it's fascinating. I've always been interested in it. And I've always found ways to kind of work on things that relate to it or adjacent to it to this day, which is great. Because I still do a fair amount of Middle East policy, more policy-oriented work at Brookings. What I would say, though, it's a tricky marriage. In terms of a legal career, because lawyers don't tend to have those regional expertise. What you can do is, if you have language skills, incredibly valuable. Because that means that any office that's really touching on that region, whether it's a litigation office or it's in private sector, whether it's they have if law firm has an office there, but in national security space, whether it's intelligence community or diplomatic office, if you can actually speak the language, you're incredibly valuable. If you can't, though, it actually doesn't hurt you on the legal side as much, because very few people are legally competent or are competent enough in a foreign language to speak it at a fluency that you need for technical legal work. So you probably, even if you're like pretty competent in Arabic or another language, you will have somebody helping you on the technical side for like agreements and things like that, because it's good practice. You wouldn't want to roll the dice on that. So it is tricky. I would say the places to look really are in the federal government, are the State Department and USAID, because they're the ones that have those sorts of intersections. State Department does not have a lot of offices that go into different regions. Most of the international offices are focused on where they're major international institutions. So it's places like Hague, Rome, Brussels, stuff like that. But there are opportunities pop up every once in a while. There's a famous position that's with the Multinational Force and Observers in the Sinai that's been there for years. I don't think it's currently being staffed for security reasons, but was there for years and years. Fascinating job. One of those jobs I always thought I wanted when I worked in L. I still think it'd be really cool to have, where you're actually like working with these peacekeepers to say, how are we going to monitor the Sinai and deal with Israeli and Egyptian pressures and stuff. So the opportunities are there, but you have to keep your focus a little broader. If you really want to go overseas as a lawyer, frankly, a lot of times the best way to do it is either a human rightsy type route, where you're working for Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or something like that, or even private practice, because a lot of places have law offices and law firms that actively want to hire people to go spend some time overseas. So those are sorts of trade-offs. The government opportunities are there, but they're a little fewer and further between, and it's hard to make your whole career out of that. Maybe you'll have the opportunity to do it for a couple of years, but you're probably not going to spend your whole career there. If I were to go back to the State Department now, I would not expect to go back to the Middle East for another period of my career, which is kind of a bummer. I actually think Office of Legal Advisor would benefit a lot from having regional offices. I pitched them, starting them at some point when I was an attorney there. Nobody took me up on it. Maybe they will one day. I think it'd be a great move and benefit the office a whole lot. But it's just those opportunities are fewer and further come between. USAID, I will say, is the one place where if you're a lawyer and you want to get overseas experience and actually spend your career overseas, it's a great place to do it, because that is an option much more there than it is for lawyers elsewhere in the executive branch.
So here's a question that'll be of special interest for our students who are veterans. A lot of veterans go into things having nothing to do with national security once they've got their law degree, but some want to practice law in a way that relates to national security. Do you think they tend to be pigeonholed as tracked towards civilian DoD law positions, or otherwise pigeonholed because of their military background?
No, I don't think so at all. It depends on. I don't think anybody's going to force you into those sorts of roles. You have a decided advantage in getting those positions, and so I think people with veterans who are veterans or have military background are often overrepresented compared to people with other backgrounds, because you obviously have expertise and experience that's relevant. You've gotten your hands dirty in terms of, like, again, you have the credibility that comes with working in the field. In many of these cases for national security, it means that you've already shown or have shown strong reasons to believe security clearance, which is relatively quickly, which is a tricky process and a problem in a lot of these jobs these days. And so, there's a reason why you see so many veterans in these jobs, but I don't think pigeonholed is really too likely to happen. Maybe it happens a little bit in the private sector where people want to use you as a marketing tool or use your experience in a certain way, but I'd be surprised if you found yourself in a position you were not, that happening at too high a regularity, unless it's something you were intentionally leaning into because you have a competitive advantage there. And in that case, I say, like, lean into it if you're at all interested in it. But I would not be too worried about that otherwise.
A really interesting topic raised by one of our incoming, not law students, but Master of Public Affairs students. And the question has to do with the advantages or disadvantages of having a law degree for those whose interest is the policy side. Don't want to practice law. I'm in this to work on policy. Is it to what extent is it an advantage to have the JD? How much of a disadvantage is it in the American system when you get in there? Are all the people in charge on the policy side actually all lawyers? Where does the law degree fit into this picture? Our non-law students anxiously want to know.
It's a great question. My advice is don't go to law school unless you know you want to be a lawyer. If you think you want to work in foreign affairs and national security, then I think a master's degree can get you there. Some people are able to do it without a master's degree. It's trickier. The best way to do it that I know of out of a program like an MPA program is through the PMF program, Presidential Management Fellows. Phenomenal program, selective, highly selective, but they still do have a lot of opportunities that give people with master's degrees the opportunity to get kind of starting level positions in a huge range of positions across the executive branch. And then you actually have the opportunity to kind of move from one office to another, try a few different places. And most people I know have done that or have been able to turn them into more full-time positions. So that's one avenue. Doing direct hire is a possibility too. You just have to keep applying over and over and over again. It's good just to get in DC and to start meeting and networking and talking to people. Going to Capitol Hill is also a good option. It's hard. It pays very badly at entry levels. Often you have to go work for free for a little while before you get enough kind of connections or enough opportunities to get a position to land, but it is doable, and you can get those sorts of positions, and a little experience on Capitol Hill will go a long way towards getting you positions in the executive branch or elsewhere. So you just have to keep your kind of head on a swivel. Other people are better positioned to advise you on how to do policy job. So I don't want to give too much advice. I'm doing this all. I've done this before for the Kennedy School, and so I have some idea about it, but I'm not an expert in this. But what I will say is there's real downsides of getting a law degree if you want to do straight policy. The downsides are it's really expensive. You spend several years learning skills that you may not need or may not need to use, although I do think they're useful at various times. And you're channeled into a place where you feel pressure, understandably, to go use your legal skills at least early in your career to build your credentials as a lawyer, and then have to find your way back to the policy route. Really, you're talking about a 5-year detour, that very expensive 5-year detour, and I just don't think it's really worth it for most people if really what you want to do is the policy side. Unless what you're doing is if you want to do international criminal law, for example, and you're yeah, having a law degree is really useful just to get the substance and to speak on that with credibility. But even that area, it's really not necessary. Plenty of non-lawyers do great work in that space. So yeah, I say only do the law degree if you really want to be a lawyer. And I say I love being a lawyer. I love having a law degree. I wholly endorse it for people who are in that box. But if you're not, don't take on the expense and time.
So I just put into the chat link, y'all, a link to register for tomorrow's event, which is our next Strauss Center event. We're packing them in here as the semester winds up, where we're going to have Adam Klein, the chair of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and another part of the growing UT Columbia Mafia. We love Adam. He's obviously got an incredibly interesting perch to comment on issues at the intersection of security, law, and privacy. So if you're interested in this talk today, come back and join us tomorrow for that one. But we've still got a few minutes left here with Scott. Let's see. I'm taking a note here of a question that just popped into the chat. We've got, oh, interesting. All right. So how should students on their way up and people coming out of school look at newly created offices? So for example, we've got sort of a propaganda and disinformation type oriented office that has just been created through the last NDAA. It's got a modest number of positions. When you see new institutional growth, new shoots on the branches of state or DOD in particular, which is where these things, especially DOD, is where you tend to see these, are these really ripe opportunities where there may be some civilian track hiring, especially for lawyers? Or is it most likely that there will be no legal position attached to a new office? And is that the wrong place to look? Or is that a good example of another area where applicants tend not to know to apply there at all?
That's a great question. And I think it's hard to generalize. It really depends on what they're doing and how they're staffing it. A lot of kind of stand-up policy offices might not have need for independent lawyers because they're counting on relying on the general counsel's office of the agency. So DOD, OGC, which is a great office, has wonderful lawyers, or State L, something like that. And so I would say most of the time, they're probably not looking specifically to hire lawyers independently, unless it's something like a whole standing new agency like CFPB, which happen to be mostly lawyers or substantially lawyers because they're doing enforcement activities, but not national security related, obviously. That said, I think getting on the ground floor of opportunities like that are really good, particularly if you're looking to do something that's a little bit more on the, political side of things, because often, the people standing it up will be in the administration, not always, but sometimes, often has some sort of tie there, because you are getting the opportunity to really help shape an institution, show how invaluable you are. Often they start out a little more horizontal because they're still figuring out their hierarchy. So I think that can be really exciting opportunities. And generally, I tend to think the smaller the shop, the better that you can work in. My best work was done, my most satisfying work experience was at Embassy Baghdad, where I ran my own shop. I was a one-man shop for most of the time I was there, and then worked really closely with the senior embassy leadership team, which really was at the most senior levels, 8-10 people, and then, slightly larger groups out from that. But getting to work with, my boss directly was really valuable. And that's nice in some of these new offices that maybe structure that way, particularly if you get in early and can show your value and maybe have an opportunity to climb a little faster.
We've got a couple more really interesting questions here towards the end. So for those who start off their career in the private sector, and let's assume they're doing something in the private sector that has some security relevance, but just in terms of sheer amount of time before trying to make the big lateral move into a government national security position, is there a rule of thumb for, there's obviously going to be people who can do it at any point, but in general, what's a good rule of thumb to have in mind for how long you could stay in the private sector before trying to make that sort of move for the first time?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think there's any length. I don't think there's any duration. Like if you're a partner and you want to make the move, like there'll be places you can make the move. Honestly, like in some ways you'll be easier if you're there for 10 years. I know people who've done that, right? Like famously, Merrick Garland spent 9 years. Arnold Porter was a partner and then decided, oh, I'm going to go be an AUSA now. Now he was Merrick Garland. Little
Yeah,
exceptional case there,
that worked out all right. Although
but
there
it's
were some
done.
hiccups along the way.
Yes, inevitably. And that there are people who do that. What I would say is you probably at a minimum want to spend 2 years at a law firm. Not, and I think generally like it is, with the exception for clerkships always being a weird outlier in legal things. 2 years is just the amount of time you need to show that you were like at a place long enough to really learn what the place is about. And so it's good to give 2-year jobs. Clerkships again are an exception to that, and taking clerkships are an exception. People understand the timing is kind of odd, and so you might have to take a clerkship after a year. I would also say, fellowships or things that may only last for a year, that's fine. People get that. But if you're at a career job and you leave after 9 months, you go to another career job, you leave after 9 months, you go to another career job, leave after 9 months, people begin to question your stick to itiveness because it is always hard to adjust to a new position, and it takes time there. And what I will say is that, I think in government, and that's something I should have mentioned before the State Department, for career jobs, I think often in government, it actually benefits you to stay even longer. To get the most out of those jobs, often you want to stay, particularly in like State Department. I'll use as an example. I really think you want to stay at least 4 or 5 years. I just felt like when I left L, that's when I felt like, oh man, I'm actually getting good at my job, because it takes you that long to get really oriented and really know what you're doing. And you climb really fast in terms of responsibilities. And so it's a really steep learning curve, and it takes a while to level that out and understand the job. But in the private sector, I think 2 years and you're fine. After 2 years, do whatever you want to do. But I would hang around for 2 years.
I like this. The 2 and 5 year rules of thumb make a lot of sense. 2 years is important for outsiders to feel confident that you didn't wear out your welcome quickly at the prior employer. Like if you stuck around 2 years, there's at least a decent chance someone there can, in a reference check setting, reveal that you were a problem the whole time. If it's shorter than that, who knows? And then 5 years, conversely, I think across a lot of complex areas of life, 5 years is a good rule of thumb for you to have fully transitioned out of novice beginner status. I do think, by the way, I think most of us think we've made that transition at the 2 year mark, but we haven't actually made it at the 2 year mark. You just think you have.
That's exactly right.
So there's a question about whether if you've got a prior experience of some kind, so let's say you were a communications professional or something like that, then you go to law, then you go into national security work. Are you advantaged? Are there some prior careers or work areas unrelated to law that are pluses, like the way that you mentioned foreign languages are a plus? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are, and really, like a lot of former skill sets are valuable. My wife, who I mentioned earlier, she spent 4 years doing international development at the State Department before deciding to go back to law school, and they're very different fields. She kind of has gone into a much more domestic direction in her legal career, just in part because that's how legal careers tend to be oriented. But she's gotten a lot out of her prior experience because she's able to say, look, I worked with people, I worked in a professional environment for several years, and I ran grants, and I handled huge chunks of money, and I had a lot of responsibility for doing X, Y, Z. So you really just have to think your prior law school career and say, what are the skills I pulled out of this, and what are the experiences, and generalize a little bit more. I saw communications, I guess, from the chat, this thing this person specifically interested in. Like communications is valuable in all sorts of different ways. Think about really the skills that are coming out, how to apply it. There aren't that many, legal offices rarely have their own spokespeople or their own people doing communications work. That tends to be sourced out to an agency. And so, there's maybe not a specific role to fill that marries those two, but think about the skills you bring in. People who have prior experience before coming back to law school have a huge advantage because that work experience really matters a lot. You just got to package it and pull out the threads that are applicable to the new legal career you're pursuing.
So one last question, then we'll let you go. So we're down to the final minute and a half. Courses that students who have a general interest in getting on the national security law track, courses in law school they should try to take, or are there none that are really particularly advantageous?
I think the best thing you can do is to come out of law school just generally is be a good generalist lawyer. So take your black letter law classes and try and do well in them and learn how the law works. But the ones I would say it's really worth taking from an national law perspective are international law, I just think is generally good, administrative law, and then legislation. Because those are the three that really, and the latter two, if you're not really interested in the international side of things, you're interested in more domestic side than the latter two, particularly, and then maybe criminal law if you're going to do the criminal side of things, because administrative law and legislation just have so much to do with the core ways government operates and government functions,
Yeah.
or leg reg. I know law schools marry those two. That's incredibly invaluable. I would make a case for Fed courts fitting as well if you're at all litigation facing.
Is there an advantage to populating your transcript with at least a handful of security specific courses as a signaling mechanism to show that you're serious or have been serious about this area?
I think yes, but I will be honest with you. I think a better way to do it is writing and activities and things where you can actually show. Now, those classes can be a great way to like write comments or papers. Even papers are good if you've written them. Although if you write something long, like try and publish it somewhere, you might as well. But showing things that are those products can be a little more valuable. But certainly showing sustained interest through coursework is one option and a reason to pursue those. And look, if you're interested in this stuff, you're going to be drawn to those courses anyway because you get to hang out with Bobby Chesney and the Strauss Center and these other great places. And so there's no reason to fight that instinct, do things you enjoy. I would say like focus on being a good lawyer. That's going to be your ultimate selling point, and the rest is going to come pretty naturally.
That's true. I think for all selective jobs in the law and in life, general demonstrations of talent and drive and responsibility, that combined with good interpersonal skills tends to be whatever else they may say, that's what draws people into making offers. Well, we made an offer to you to come appear before our students, and you accepted and delivered. And we are so glad you did, Scott. It was really nice spending time with you. Thanks for sharing that experience and wisdom with our students.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. And I will say, Bobby and Alice and other people involved in organizing have my email address. You guys should feel free to send me an email or follow up by writing. I'm happy to schedule time to chat or just trade email message or anything with any questions or anything else you guys want to talk about.
Awesome. All right. You are off the hot seat. Thanks, y'all. Everybody who attended, really appreciate you. Hope to see you tomorrow. Bye-bye, everyone.